Let's get rocking and rolling here. We've got a big meeting today, and thank you for joining the Water Environment Task Force. Um, just a little bit of water news. There was really a super article by the Wall Street Journal on Shasta Reservoir 2 days ago, and I sent the link to Lindy, and maybe she can, if you can, put that in the chat. It's worth a read. It's pretty a dire story. You know, that reservoir is sitting up there. It's one of our major ones for the state of California. It's at 33%. They actually had to bring huge chillers in to cool the water that's being released for the salmon downstream, and that's a huge expense, but that gives you an idea of how dire the situation is out there. And I see Lindy just put the link there, so I recommend a read on that. And so the reservoir levels, as you guys know, is something we watch, but it's really bad. I guess if there's any good news out there is that we don't have any major fire campaign fires going on in the state, unbelievably, because dry October is oftentimes a period where we get some huge wildfires, and you know we burnt up to 4 million acres a year. This year, I think we're at about 400,000. So it's just been a cooler time, and you know, in September we got a nice rainstorm that came through, and it's been cooler here in the Bay Area. So the weather's a nice fall, and luckily, knock on wood, no major fires yeah, at this time. So one thing that I wanted to bring up, that the planning committee for the Water Environment Task Force is working on a strategic plan. And we met a week ago, and we talked about where does this Water Environment Task Force, what are we doing over the next year? And the East Bay Leadership Council would like their task forces to each do a strategic plan. And I think, not surprising, you would see in our plan that we're going to focus on key water issues and key environmental issues. But the one difference I'd say this year is that we are going to add energy into our strategic planning. And so that's new for us. And I think it's very fitting. You know, today we're going to have a presentation from the Lawrence Livermore National Lab on getting to carbon neutral by 2045, which is actually a state mandate. How do you do that? And so it's a very energy focused conversation. And the other thing I would say is that with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act in August, the federal government is putting forward a very unprecedented benefit for the development of renewable energy projects, in that public agencies now will be able to file directly with the Treasury for a direct pay up to 40% of a project. And I'll tell you, part of my focus in my company is on renewable energy and now microgridding. So just put a lot of money on the table that you don't have to compete for. It's not a grant, it's simply a tax. And those tax credits used to be only available to entities that paid taxes, like private companies, but now it's open to public agencies. So I advocate to you, and I've got a lot of information on it. If you want to reach out to me, I can share that. Happy to share that with you. The more people that know about this, the better, in my opinion. So in our planning committee, we've got Lindy Johnson, George Smith, Dan McIntyre, Audrey London, Bob Whitley, Ann Spalding, Dave Richardson, Dave Requa, and Don Berger. And our newest members now are Catherine Horn from East Bay Mud, Eric Byland from WSP. And welcome to you guys. Thank you for participating. We like to add some new blood to the planning committee. We meet quarterly, and along those lines, if you have an interest, because what we do is we focus on what are the upcoming speakers that we want to ask to address this group. And so it's a fun meeting, and it allows you to share your passion for the water industry and your ideas on who we might get as speakers. So if you're interested in that, approach any one of us about that if you want to get involved. So let's see, with that, let's do the upcoming agenda first. Audrey, if you don't mind, the next 3 meetings that we're planning on.
Sure. And speaking of the upcoming speakers, we've got on November 15th, effects of sea level rise and unanticipated geologic impacts, presented by Reed Fisher of Cal Engineering and Geology, Inc. It'll be a live in-person meeting. And then in December, we will have no meeting. So enjoy your holidays, and we'll reconvene in January with the Antioch Desalination Project, which will be a virtual meeting. Back to you, Gary.
Right. Thank you very much. And now we are to announcements. Lindy, do you have anything on behalf of the East Bay leadership?
I do. Thank you, Gary. I have two announcements. The first is that our Philanthropy Awards is coming up. Hopefully, some of you have been there in the past. It's a very inspirational event, but the last few years we've been doing it over Zoom, and we are finally getting back in person. So we're doing it at the Lesher Center this year. Is more of a traditional award show. So there'll be a big stage and a lot of lights and some really phenomenal organizations. Thank you to everyone who nominated. We got a lot of nominations this year, which is great, but also makes it harder. But anyway, the event itself is coming up, and I'm going to put a link in the chat for those of you who might be interested in joining us. Even if it's not necessarily the sector you work in, I do think that it's a very inspirational morning, like a great time to start, or sorry, a great way to start your morning, and a great time of year, because we do kind of envelop the whole idea of thankfulness and gratitude during November. And so we're happy to host the Philanthropy Awards during that month. So look out for the link in the chat for that event. I also wanted to introduce our newest staff member. Meg Stern is here with us this morning. Meg, do you want to just say hello to everyone and just kind of unmute and maybe wave at least?
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me here today. I'm excited to hear all about what's going on. And yeah, this is my second day, so I'm still learning, but thanks for having me here.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Jumping right in.
Yeah. What's your past employment, Meg, or school?
I just graduated from UC Berkeley at the end of this past year. I was a political science major.
Wow.
And
Very
Meg is being
impressive.
very humble because she's also an incredible artist.
Wow.
Thank you.
Okay. Welcome. And then
That's all I
we've got announcement from Central Sand, the general manager, Roger Bailey, and then I'm hoping that somebody from Los Vaqueros, Jennifer, Ernie, or Marguerite can give us the good news regarding new money for expanding Los Vaqueros. But before I introduce Roger, on behalf of the entire Water Environment Task Force, I just wanted to wish Lindy well during your upcoming maternity leave. She's here for the next 2 weeks, as I understand it, and then she will be off doing maternity leave. So I know that it's such a special time in life, Lindy. I've been through two of having two kids, and it feels like that next day that you're waking up to the best Christmas present you can even possibly think about in your life. And that continues for a while until you realize that little person doesn't sleep on your schedule and will make you so tired. So good luck on all of that. Enjoy it. It's such a special time. So
Thank you all so much. I'm really looking forward to it. And, you know, the sleep deprivation has been well warned, so I appreciate that.
very good. So I wanted to hand it over to Roger for a great announcement. And for those of you who don't know Roger, his background, he comes from very high level public works positions in Arizona and then San Diego. And he's worked a lot and very passionate about water issues. And since he's been at Central Sand, he's led a couple of great initiatives. One that is that we have not really covered very well with this committee, but we should, and that's a water exchange that could go on where Central Sand provides recycled water to the refineries. That block of water then can wheel through rather than using Contra Costa Canal or the CBP water that's up for exchange with another CBP agency, and that in this case is Valley Water out of Santa Clara. They need water very desperately. And so that block of water is in development, and I applaud Roger and all of Central Sand and Contra Costa and Valley Water for working on that important issue. Today, Roger is going to announce a town hall meeting and a focus on recycled water, and I turn it over to Roger.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks for the kind words. I saw that Jennifer Allen had her hands up earlier on. So before I get started, Jennifer, did you want to say something?
No, I was just letting Gary know that I was here to talk about Los Vaqueros. So Roger, all you.
Okay, good. Okay.
Thanks, Jennifer.
And Lindy, congratulations. Wish you all the best. As Gary said, these are really exciting times, and your life will be much better moving forward, and I can attest to that, having two girls. So anyway, congratulations. Gary, I do appreciate the opportunity, and I wouldn't be long. There are two things that are exciting here. One of them, we're gonna have a town hall next week, the 26th, and it's being sponsored by Rossmore, East Bay Mud, and Central Sand, and the topic is recycled water within the region. This was really initiated by Rossmore. As you know, they are concerned about having recycled water for all the reasons that everyone wants recycled water. And they have been looking at some innovative concepts and have reached out to us, and we decided that we will engage in that conversation with them, and that conversation evolved into a bigger question on what is the state of water in central Contra Costa. So Dave Williams, our current board president, and I met with their board president and also the chief operating officer. And we also invited East Bay Mud to the conversation, and it evolved into the idea of let's put on a town hall to discuss some of the things that can be done as it relates to recycled water and just wet water in general. And so this town hall will be held next week, the 26th, at Lafayette Veterans Center at around noon. We will be sponsoring lunch, Central Sand, and hopefully that's a kind of an incentive for folks to show up. We are expecting 200 people, at least the capacity is 200 people. So far, 115 have RSVP. I would encourage this group to try to attend, as many of you as possible. You are the innovative voice for the region. You are always on the cutting edge of ideas that I think are constructive and important as we move forward as a region. I personally believe that we have to start to look at water in a slightly different way, and kind of a roll up our sleeves and utilize some of the things that others have used successfully. And I will get into that in our second announcement here. The second announcement is a MOU that Central Sand has entered into with East Bay Mud, and this is really exciting stuff. As the group, though, Central Sand has an MOU with CCWD and Santa Clara Valley Water District to look at the concept of water exchange. Well, we have just recently entered into an MOU with East Bay Mud, and we should also include CCWD. CCWD has been just a strategic partner with Central Sand, and without CCWD, none of what we are going to talk about would work. So very critical to the conversation. But our MOU with East Bay Mud, and Dave Richardson will be doing some studies with East Bay Mud. This is a very exciting issue for us. The general concept here is for East Bay Mud to work with us and us with them to look at innovative ways in which we can fully bring to bear the recycled water or the water that we are currently discharging into the bay and put it into beneficial use and try to find the most optimal way to do that. And one of those ways is this water exchange concept. And the water exchange concept is relevant to East Bay Mud. They could be the partner in lieu of Santa Clara for many different reasons. One of them, we have the two refineries next door to us that CCWD that currently serve. And under that scenario that we're looking at, CCWD will be made whole financially. They would not be penalized or be in jeopardy for losing their customer. There will also, any water rights issues, we'll make sure that we try to protect that. But instead of bringing in the potable water or raw water that they deliver to the refineries, we could treat the water that we currently have to a standard high enough for the refineries to take in lieu of that water. And in turn, CCWD through Las Vaqueras could exchange that supply with East Bay mud, if like the concept with Santa Clara. And so that will be one option. Another option could be for East Bay mud, to the extent at some future time they would like to do potable reuse. They have an aqueduct that runs very close to us. And the work that we will need to do the refinery project will not be all in vain, because it's the same types of improvements that we will need to make in order to make the potable reuse happen. So to the extent that some future date, East Bay Mud wanted to do potable reuse, and I think it's the way of the future, we could enter into an agreement with them, and they could take the highly treated effluent that we have and purify it even more. And they could utilize a piece of land that we currently have on the east side of the river, of the Walnut Creek actually, and build a purified facility and put that treated, highly treated water into the aqueduct, and then take it into storage and eventually treat it again. So I'm very excited that Dave Richardson will be working with East Bay Mud and us, and Dave has worked with us on some concepts of getting recycled water to Rossmore, to Lama Winda area, and to certain parts of Walnut Creek. And I've told Dave that all of the information that he has from our studies is fair game for anybody. There's no secret. We want to be open. We want to be very collaborative. And what we really want to do is to help the public to solve the problem of water supply. And I think we need to act with a sense of urgency. I think that we need to embrace these concepts and try to generate as much public support for them as possible. So this is very exciting time. I'm very thankful that East Bay Mud has really decided to enter into this MOU. And I hope that at the end of the study that Dave Richardson is going to do for them, that we can come up with some action items to put these things into reality. I'll bring them into reality. So that's just a quick announcement. Again, it would be great to see you at the Water Forum next week in Lafayette. I'm available for any questions if you have any.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. What you're talking about is very cutting edge, very visionary, and I applaud you and the leadership in the Bay Area that we have now to even be able to have this conversation. Wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. I know that, and so your experience from the drier parts of the United States and the passion that you have for water, you realize that the Bay Area needs to be paying attention, and wastewater is a source of water for us for many uses, all the way to, like is happening around the world, to treat it at such a high level to either indirectly or in some cases directly potable reuse. So my hat's off to you on that. And I will just give a nod to Dave Richardson. I've been using him as my go-to guy on recycled water and other things back when I was even at East Bay Mud working on Freeport. And so, Dave, you've got a lot of imagination. I'm glad that you're in the driver's seat on this. And just finally, Roger, I know the cities also are very interested in this. My wife is on the city council of Walnut Creek, and her and I have talked about this opportunity. So the cities, I think, are open to it. They're very excited. And for Walnut Creek, they cover Rossmore, and Rossmore is very, very interested in, why not? Why not be using recycled water rather than McCallum water to water a golf course for Rossmore? So congratulations. And we're going to, part of our job as a part of our strategic plan is to advocate for you and all of these kind of ideas out there. And so we will look to set up a time where you guys, when it's right, to lay this out in more detail for this group. And again, we're here to support you. So thank you very much. Dave, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Gary. I just want to be clear that we have been doing a lot of work on these concepts in the past. East Bay Mud may or may not put an RFP out to support them for the MOU. I think they probably will and will be competing for that work. So Roger, thank you for your vote of confidence, but others may also be interested in the project, but it's a great one and look forward to following it and keeping this group informed.
Good. Thanks, Dave. Well, maybe I'll bid on it then. All right. We also have some really fantastic news from Contra Costa Water District, and Jennifer Allen volunteered to go ahead and announce that.
Thanks, Gary. So just quickly, just yesterday, the Bureau of Reclamation or Department of Interior announced that they have $210 million from the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed. And this is for drought resilient projects in the West. And we're happy to say that Los Vaqueros expansion was awarded $82 million of that pot of money. It's not all that we need from the federal government, but it's definitely a good size chunk that going towards the project. And so just appreciate the ongoing support from the East Bay Leadership Council and this task force, and we'll bring more updates as other news comes up about the project. So thanks.
Thank you. That's huge news. At some point in time, we're going to be expanding Los Vaqueros for free, right? So good heads up. There's so much money out there right now at both the state and the federal level. Paying attention to that is very, very important right now. So congratulations, guys, on that. Any other announcements before we turn on to our speakers?
Just one quick one, Gary. The Industrial Association Forum Luncheon next Tuesday, the 25th. The speaker will be Assemblyman Tim Grayson, and that will be at Zio Fredo's restaurant, which I believe is in Pleasant Hill, and that starts at 11:30 a.m.
Thank you. Hey, Lindy, do you mind sending out the announcement for the press release from Rossmore on the forum that Roger just talked about? That way, everybody, you can see it and decide whether or not you're going to attend.
It's actually in the chat. We put something up on our blog for it. So we've also posted it on our LinkedIn if that's easier for folks.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much. So today we are honored to have two speakers, two scientists from the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. One of them I've worked with for several years and have a great admiration for. And I love it. In his LinkedIn page, he says that he's devoting his career to public policy advocacy and changing the laws, regulations, and treaties to protect public health. And that truly is the case. His name is George Peridas, and he will be our first speaker. And he's going to talk about carbon management and the work that the Lawrence Livermore National Lab have been doing. And then follow up with that is Sarah Baker. She's a staff scientist at Lawrence Livermore. She's worked there over 15 years, and she is a key author in getting to neutral, that we know is a state initiative that if we do not cut back our carbons, if we do not sequester, if we do not manage our organics differently, the climate change will continue to happen, even at an accelerated pace. So this is the science behind what to do about climate change. And so I'm very excited to introduce George. Will be our first speaker. And at the end of when George and Sarah are done, then George Smith will take over as moderator to moderate questions for the group. And so with that, George, go for it.
Well, good morning, everyone. Gary, Lindy, thank you very much for having us here today. Great to join this group. My name is George Peridas. I'm a mechanical engineer by training. I came from Europe to the US in 2006 to work on climate change. And back then I was hired in the NGO world by NRDC to take a deep dive into something called carbon capture and storage. And so here I am 15 years or so later. I joined the lab just under 4 years ago. It's a very large team of people with large brains, and we've been applying this resourcefulness and brain power to try and solve some of the hardest problems that we face, one of which is climate change. So I'm going to start with some generic explanations behind negative emissions and where those fit into the climate mitigation portfolio. Sarah was the mastermind and the tireless leader of a recent study that we did called Getting to Neutral, which mapped out how California can get to carbon neutrality by mid-century. And since that time, that was just before COVID hit. And since that time, we've actually expanded our work in that direction to work for corporations who have made carbon neutrality pledges. We're currently in the throes of doing a national study. So the recipe seems to have been very successful, and we are replicating it and expanding it. Can I share my screen? Do I have permission? Okay, great.
Yep.
Doesn't look like it. It says host disabled screen sharing.
Give me 1 second, George. I'll edit that.
All right, George, this is a pause, so this is the time for you to tell a joke or something.
It's
George,
2
is
in the
that
morning for
working for
that.
you? Is it working
Let's
now?
try. Let's see. Yeah, it looks like it. So,
Perfect. Sorry about that.
okay. So there we go. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Yes, we
Excellent.
can.
All right. So where do negative emissions fit, and what are they to begin with? So this is a generic graph, but it's pretty typical of the situation worldwide, nationwide, and not just for the US, but many nations. And with some exceptions, I think it also applies to states and California as well. So there's something called the carbon budget, which says that we arrive at what we think is a safe, quote unquote, limit for average global warming. And then we say, okay, what do world emissions need to do in order to stay within that envelope? And please keep in mind here that the world the planet is a system with quite a bit of inertia. So even if we magically snapped our fingers today and stopped emitting greenhouse gases altogether, we are already committed to a certain degree of warming. So unfortunately, the picture that we get, if you look at this yellow business as usual line, is that because we've been late in tackling the problem, and because there's human inertia as well in the system, we're not acting fast enough. So emissions are projected generally to rise for some years to come. And then we think that they're going to peak around mid-century, plus or minus, and then start to decline. Now, that trajectory is completely inconsistent with what we call safe global warming. So enter the red line, which says, okay, if we were to accept a global warming of average warming of 2 degrees Celsius, which indications are that it's anything but safe. Unfortunately, these estimates keep getting revised every few years, and the numbers that we keep getting back are, well, actually, they should be lower. So we started with 2 degrees. Now the new norm has been for some years now 1.5 degrees as the safe limit. And in real time, studies, papers are coming back, and we're realizing that the feedback signals that we're getting from the Earth are even more severe. So keep in mind that that 2 degree line should be even lower. So without doing anything, we will carry on growing our emissions. If we take concerted policy action, then we think that we can kink the curve downwards more severely and reach net zero way too late. So latter part of the century. And why is that? Well, some things we have made great strides in, but some things are hard to decarbonize. And it really does depend on your perspective. 15 years ago, when I arrived in the country, we were mostly worried about coal-fired power plants. The shale gas boom took care of that, and gas emerged as the winner, so that dipped emissions downwards somewhat. If you look at California, as you'll see in a minute, we have a very different situation. We haven't had any coal generation in a while, but our biggest Achilles heel, climate-wise, is transportation. But in any case, regardless of the jurisdiction, you always end up with a cluster of sectors that are hard to decarbonize. And these include things like aviation, heavy trucking, agriculture, wildfires, several things that do not lend themselves to easy emission reductions. So you're left with what's called residual emissions, things that even if we intensify and redouble our conventional mitigation efforts on, you're still left with some emissions. And that's the gray part that's above the horizontal axis. So enter the concept of negative emissions, which says, okay, so we can't bring everything down to zero, but what if we were to find ways to actively remove carbon from the atmosphere? And that's what's called negative emissions. Or some people call it CDR, carbon dioxide removal, or just carbon removal. So the idea is net out the positive term in the emissions equation by finding ways to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And that also has value later on in the century, because if you end up with too high concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, even after you've netted out your positive emissions, then you can find ways to go even more negative. So I will point out that this is not a silver bullet. So we're not advocating that we turn to negative emissions in lieu of traditional mitigation. This is generally focused on the last 20%. So we're not claiming here that this has superhuman powers and that by using that instead of other stuff, we can solve climate change. This is a monumental task to begin with, and this is a supplement, but a very important one. So what Livermore Lab has done, we tend to focus on hard problems, is to say, okay, we're doing reasonably well on some mitigation sectors, but we think that we are grossly behind when it comes to this last 20% of the solutions portfolio. So over the past few years, we have thrown resources and brainpower and analysis at figuring out how we get that last 20%. And this is where the studies that you'll hear about today come in. So with that context, let's take a closer look at California. This is a set of statistics from the Air Resources Board, which does a greenhouse gas inventory. On the left, you will see that the bulk of our greenhouse gas emissions are carbon dioxide. And then we have other things like methane, nitrous oxides, high global warming potential gases. And on the right, you'll see where these are coming from. So the blue slice of the pie on the right, this is our oversized compared to other jurisdictions, at least transportation sector. We drive a lot and we move things around, and we have ports that necessitate the burning of fossil fuels for transportation. Our electric sector is a lot cleaner than in other places. We also have industry, including petroleum refining, cement, cogeneration, and so on. And then you'll see that we have other smaller sectors. Do keep in mind that this inventory is not all inclusive. So emissions from natural and working lands, including wildfires, are not in here. There's a study that came out just a few days ago, which I haven't double-checked the validity of it, but the headline was that wildfire emissions from the year 2020 alone undid about 15, 16 years worth of emission reduction efforts by the state. So this is just as not trying to cast a downer here, but a backdrop as to the magnitude of the challenge. So what's the conclusion from all this? So this is we arrived at this conclusion, and the Air Resources Board has also arrived at the same conclusion in its latest scoping plan. For those of you who don't know what this is, it's a blueprint that gets updated about every 5 years about how the state is going to meet its climate goals. So this is a a chart that's taken from the latest draft scoping plan. It's scheduled to be finalized by the end of the year, and it shows that the same thing, even in a California context, even after you apply pretty drastic and ambitious mitigation efforts, you're still left with residual emissions. And the only way that CARB thinks that we can net those out is by doing carbon dioxide removal. So the diagonal stripes below the x-axis there show how much removal from the atmosphere of CO2 CARB things we need to do in order to meet those goals. So this is the perfect backdrop for getting to neutral. I hope Sarah has joined and she can talk about that. The goal behind it was to figure out, can we actually get those numbers? So I'm going to stop sharing here.
Sarah, I see that you're on now. Is that right?
I am here. Do we want to pause or should I just dive right in?
Dive right in.
Okay.
You've been introduced, by the way. So
Oh, wow. I'm not able to share my screen.
Hold on 1 second, Sarah. I didn't know that your name was under Baker. I will make that edit. Hold on 1 second. There we go.
All right. Apologies, I'm not on the right slide here. Okay. All right, so I'm going to give an overview of the major findings of the report and a little bit about the big ideas that came out of this report called Getting to Neutral. As George described, really looking at how we can reach net zero in California by removing the residual emissions that are going to remain in our economy for some time. I don't know whether George said anything about our initiative, but just to give more of an overview of our program here and how we're able to write reports like this, we have what we call a carbon initiative at Lawrence Livermore Lab. We've been around for about 8 years. And so George talked about understanding the removal needs. The report, which I'm going to describe, is part of that. We have at least 70 people now working on these areas. So we've grown quite rapidly, and it's quite inspiring to see. But we're not only working on the systems level analysis to understand our options for removal, we're also working on technologies for carbon removal and CO2 conversion, understanding soil carbon, and also systems and geologic storage. And then George is working, and I believe we'll talk a bit about community outreach, which is of course a necessary piece of this. And then we're looking toward implementation as well, how we get over these implementation gaps. So a timeline here, don't need to belabor this, but the report that I'm going to just briefly describe was released in January 2020 in a crowded room in the Capitol building right before the pandemic. And following that, we were contacted by Microsoft. I'm not going to talk about the findings of that report, but they contacted us to help them understand how they can reach carbon neutrality or carbon negative emissions by 2030 for all of their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And now we are working on a national report. This slide's outdated. It's called Roads to Removal. And we're carrying forward what we learned in California to the whole country, and also learning that the country has other aspects that we need to learn about and explore because of how diverse our country is. So we're looking to release, this is of course not the cover for the road to removal report, looking to release that in about a year. All right, so George went over this, why we need this green wedge, why we need a new set of solutions to get to neutral in California. Our report was assuming that we needed 125 million tons per year by 2045. And so this was really the first comprehensive assessment of the available solutions for California. And we didn't have any sort of horse in this race, just looking at what's available with enough information for us to assess the costs and the feasibility of the solutions. So the solutions for negative emissions can be summarized in the following three major categories in California. So we're looking at, of course, how to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and into some sort of stored state. So the probably one option that everyone knows about is that you can store carbon dioxide in natural ecosystems, so trees and soils primarily. One can also, here, let me move my window here. One can also look to using biomass. So biomass are plants and trees and agriculture are already solar powered little carbon capture machines. So they capture and store carbon dioxide, and a lot of this biomass then goes to waste by sitting in a field or burning. And instead of that, we could use waste biomass and create, capture the energy and also capture the carbon and create fuels to decarbonize and also store that carbon dioxide underground. And the third option is called direct air capture. And so this is using machines to directly suck CO2 out of the air. And so options 2 and 3 require geologic storage. So option 1 is what we call natural solutions, and 2 and 3 are requiring geologic storage, sometimes referred to as engineered solutions. So what I'm showing here is a major takeaway of the report. So, it was comprehensive, looking at all of the costs incurred from, and also the capacity, so how much can we actually remove, all the way from starting at carbon dioxide in the air, all the way to securely storing it. That also includes the need to transport it in some cases. So these numbers here, 25, 84, 16, these represent the fraction of that 125 million tons that get us to the lowest cost, combination of solutions for removing 125 million tons. Now, one takeaway here is that we need all of these three types of removal options. We can't get there with natural solutions alone. We also found that this waste biomass conversion can be a really, really impactful solution for California and remove the most carbon dioxide at an intermediate cost. And we'll also need direct air capture, which has a bit higher cost, but is also not limited by biomass availability or land or anything like that. And another major takeaway here is that we can remove 125 million tons a year by 2045 with the technologies that are available today. So no breakthroughs are required, but we got to get moving because these are major projects in some cases. As I said, we looked at every single part of this pathway from CO2 in the air to safe storage. We found that the transportation and permanent geologic storage piece were not a significant fraction of the total cost. And of course, if we're going to store it underground, we need to start thinking about where that might be and what the capacity is. So part of our report was doing more higher resolution mapping of good places to store carbon dioxide underground in California. The geologists focused on these two areas here. The good news is they found that there is almost seemingly unlimited geologic storage capacity in California. So that is not a concern. This whole process from going from the air to geologic storage can happen within our state. And so this is our a supply curve of showing again how to get this lowest cost set of solutions. So I can walk through this briefly, but it was sort of highlighted already on the other slide. But I didn't show costs. So we think about costs for this removal as dollars per ton carbon dioxide. Very simple. No incentives, just how much would it cost to do this job. You can see over here in green are the natural solutions. These are coming in at much less than $50 per ton. Actually, it says 11 here. And so really attractive, least technologically complex, lowest cost, but the capacity is on this axis is million tons per year. Capacity is not going to get us all the way, as I said. Over here on the right side is the direct air capture. And you can see these are projected to be the highest cost at about around $200 per ton. And this is needed to fill that gap to get us all the way to 125. And in the middle are the biomass conversion solutions. So broadly, we're looking at here taking a waste biomass, so agricultural residues, forest restoration biomass, so removing biomass from forests to prevent fires, and doing what's called gasification. We found that gasifying waste biomass to hydrogen is actually an extremely attractive solution because you get the most bang for your buck. You get as much carbon dioxide out of that biomass as you can, and then you are creating hydrogen from which you get a revenue. So this comes in down here at about $20 to $50 per ton. And over here, I think some of you are interested in wastewater treatment. This $96 per ton is using biogas to create electricity with carbon capture. So can be a piece of this puzzle here. All right, so this is a summary of what is needed, but what you get from doing this. So this is, again, a major endeavor to remove 125 million tons a year, and entirely possible. We found the total system cost was around 10 billion back in 2020. This is less than it costs to manage solid waste in California, so it implies that we can also manage the trash we've put in the air. But this is, again, major infrastructure projects, 50 to 100 new biomass plants. The lowest cost way to transport CO2 is in a pipeline network. We need to get started on these storage options. But what do we get out of it? Wildfire prevention, improve air quality, jobs. And then if we're creating fuels, we're going to be reducing emissions even faster. And of course, California being a first mover here, we can show the world that this is possible. How am I doing on time? I could do a little bit of more current work, a few more minutes or.
Yeah, you've got time.
Okay. All right, so I talked about the need to move, and that all of these solutions on paper work out, and they've been demonstrated at various scales, but there is an implementation gap, you know, to get started on these projects. And I just wanted to say that at Livermore, we are working on bringing all the tools we have to bear on addressing this implementation gap as well, from, you know, for earlier stage technologies, high performance computing, advanced manufacturing, to really de-risk some of these technologies faster. Out of the report, some big ideas emerged that are quite impactful. As I said, the first is that we can't get all the way to neutral with natural solutions alone. Thinking about biomass not as an energy source, but a carbon source, a carbon dioxide removal source, is actually a new way to think about it. Having impacts across the state. And then finally, as I mentioned, making hydrogen from waste biomass is a really attractive solution because, you know, we're generating essentially carbon negative hydrogen as well as maximizing the removal that we can get from each ton of biomass. As George said, CARB scoping plan now also projects the need for negative emissions, and this is a relatively new development. It's really nice to see that alignment. So this is now like an update of since the report was published. I think George is going to talk a little bit about now what's really exciting is projects for geologic storage of CO2 are starting in the state for the first time ever. And then a little bit of an overview of our national report funded by the Department of Energy, multiple offices there. As I said, we're finding that, of course, the options and considerations in California are going to be different than the rest of the country. So we are, you know, looking at the Corn Belt and you know, the potential for negative emissions from that type of agriculture. Other parts of the country have pretty active timber industry. And then, of course, California has great geologic storage, but not the whole country does not. So really looking at negative emission solutions when you cannot put the CO2 directly underground within that region. And I believe this is my last technical slide. It's just a little preview of this national report. As I said, the country has very diverse considerations when we think about negative emissions. And so I'm leading the biomass carbon removal team. So this is this biomass conversion set of solutions. And what's shown here is that we divided the continental US into, I believe, 14 regions. According to the type of biomass that is waste biomass that's present. And so you can see we have agriculture, we have municipal solid waste and timberlands. And so you can see that's represented by these pies. And then the size of the pie, so you can see, you know, how diverse this is, right? Where we have agriculture here, and we have a lot of, you know, municipal solid waste over here and down here. And the size of these pies corresponds to how much of that biomass in that region, how much of that region is over a geologic storage area. So some of these regions, like up here, you can hardly see the pie because there's really no storage resources. So one of the things we're looking at is tailoring the conversion technologies and the sequestration for each of these specific types of cases. All right, so to conclude, just what our major role here that we hope to play is to understand the options available and then make connections with the players and provide information for those who want to play a role in carbon removal. And with that, I'll stop sharing.
Okay, why don't we turn it over to questions? Anyone have questions at this point?
George, I think George Peridas is going to.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, speak a little bit
Oh,
more.
I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry for that. Thank you.
So quickly here, just to mention another report that we did. So the inescapable conclusion from what Sarah outlined as a study is that we can't put all the carbon, we can only put about a fifth or maybe a fourth into natural systems. So where does the rest of it go? We remove it from the atmosphere, but what's its end resting place? Well, the answer is back where it came from. And that means thousands of feet underground and sedimentary rocks where we found the fossil fuels to begin with. So nature has held oil and gas and CO2 and other fluids for up to hundreds of millions of years. And the idea here is to reverse that process. So for those of you who work on water, we inject well below the groundwater horizon. So this is a mile deep or even more. California is host in the Central Valley to very deep sedimentary basins that go, 12,000 feet deep. So from 5,500 feet onwards is where we inject. This has been studied very extensively over several decades, and that's where the carbon will end up. So rational follow-up question was, can we administratively pull this off? Is the regulatory framework in California sufficient to make sure that these kinds of volumes that Sarah talked about, 100 or so million tons of CO2 per year, can find their way back on the ground? So this is the cover from a report that we issued in February of last year, which looked at the regulatory framework for these projects in California. And let's see, can we advance? There we go. The emerging picture was that yes, but it's pretty damn complex. So you have three parts to any project. You have the capture, you have the transport, and then you have the storage or injection. And the picture that transpires is that we have an overlay of agencies and authorities that need to give approvals, and these can be local governments, so cities and counties. It can be the state itself with its multitude of state agencies. There's the federal government with several agencies that themselves come into the picture, such as BLM, Army Corps of Engineers. In some cases, you may have tribal governments, and in other cases, you may even have a private party. So if you want to inject CO2 under someone's land, then you need their permission. And the owner of the land may not be the same as the owner of the minerals under the land. So there are some private negotiations involved. So on the left here, you'll see a sort of a matrix picture that relates to who has jurisdiction over different parts of the project. So for local land use, that will be the local government. That's a simple one. For siting CO2 pipelines, because you're crossing potentially lots of different types of ownership, you may have local government, state government, federal land, possibly tribal land, possibly private land. I'm not going to go through each one, but you can see that, for CO2 pipeline safety, there's a state agency and a federal agency involved. If you're going to be dealing with areas where there are endangered species involved, then you have both the federal and the state regulator. So it's a pretty complex picture. On the right, we try to grade the various permitting tasks according to how long they may take to get authorizations, their technical complexity, because something that's technically complex you would think will take longer, but something that's easier doesn't necessarily mean that it can be done quickly for administrative reasons. And then the far right column is a metric of political exposure. So to what extent can someone who is hell-bent on stopping this say, you know what, I'm going to litigate against you, and I'm going to hijack all the public hearings, and I'm going to make damn sure that this never happens. So, I'll again this is in the report, but I'll run through a couple of lines just illustratively. So for air permits, we think that these will take a long time. This applies mainly to the capture side of things. It is technically complex, and it also is, medium political exposure. So someone who knows air regulations, you're dealing with local air districts, and you're dealing potentially with US EPA. There are many opportunities for public involvement here.
George, Bob Whitley has a quick question for you.
Yeah, please.
I can wait until you're finished, George.
Up to you.
Huh? Go ahead.
I've
Finish.
got a couple more slides. Up to you.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So it's a pretty complex picture. And there's also some updates that are hot off the press here. So these are our major findings, and I won't have you read word for word, but very quickly, we think that the framework is in place. So we're not lost at sea, and we're not missing out any huge safety points. So, the bases are covered. This cannot be done any old how or willy-nilly. The regulations are in place to protect public health and safety. We think that the current framework is not sufficient for meeting California's climate goals, and the reason is speed. So we need probably tens or hundreds of these projects to ramp up to the numbers that Sarah described that we need for carbon removal in the States, in the state. And under the current structures, we cannot permit such a number fast enough. And that's because you have authority and jurisdiction spread out in so many agencies at different levels. Environmental review, also known as review under CEQA in California, is a particularly tough one. And we think that this will span many years in some cases, and that's going to be a potential bottleneck or the rates determining step for project authorization. The whole process can be made more efficient while retaining its integrity and not compromising its original objective, which is to protect our state and our people. We think that a small number of technical fixes would enable deployment at the right pace. And then if you're a developer, be advised that you will need to have specialized people and competent people staffing this. This is not a spare time DIY kind of thing. You need people with very strong and specific skills. One final word here before I close. A bill passed, SB 905, in literally the last few hours of the legislative session that ended in August. Governor Newsom came in fairly late in the process with his own climate priorities and proposed language, and there was a flurry of last-minute amendments. And SB 905 does actually address several of the points that you have here in front of you. One of them is that the California Natural Resources Agency, CNRA, is tasked with putting together a one-stop shop permitting regime for projects like this. So rather than, if I'm reading the bill correctly, you will have a choice. So you can you can contact the 15 agencies that you have to contact right now, or in the future when the framework is complete, you will have a choice to let CNRA do all that for you, and you will only liaise with somebody from CNRA. So this is, for those of you familiar with it, I guess it has a parallel in how the Energy Commission permits power plants over a certain size. So I think that this is the states and the legislature responding and registering this need to streamline the process. And that doesn't mean that we're going to try and approve projects that needn't be approved, but at least it's a clearer division of responsibilities. And then the other two things that transpired from that bill very quickly without going into details is that the California Geological Survey will get a sum of money to build up its capacity, scientific capacity, to help with geology expertise and reservoir characterization. And then finally, CARB gets to build a program that will, quote unquote, facilitate, where appropriate, carbon removal projects. So this is the operative clause, and it comes with a couple of pages worth of things that need to happen under that program, including monitoring, financial responsibility. So there's a very long list of assurances and modalities that need to take place for these projects to be deployed. So, love to hear your questions. Hope that was useful.
Okay, thank you, George and Sarah. Excellent job on the presentation. We have time for questions. I have two people thus far who raised their hands, Bob Whitley and Harold Mantle. Bob, we'll start with you.
Bob, did you want to go?
Sure, thank you. So thank you, very good presentation and thought-provoking. My question is, what is the lab doing about discussions about the investment needs? This is major capital investment, any way you look at it. And I asked this question because 40 years ago, I was directly involved in a biomass conversion project to electricity. Of course, climate change was not an issue 40 years ago. But the conversion of electricity generated a revenue stream. Unfortunately, the capital requirements were not met, and the whole concept collapsed. One of my unfortunate experiences. But capital investment is going to be needed to a large amount. And what is the revenue stream, if any? And where does the money come from for the investment? I know the simple answer is government will do it. But it seems that in order for any of this to proceed, the investment potential needs to be addressed.
Sarah, I can take that if you like. So there's a combination of revenue streams and sources that are available today, and it's really only the last few months that they have converged or coalesced in a way that we think is sufficient for deployment. So there's a state program, low carbon fuel standard, which you may be aware of. When the report was written, the credit value for that was hovering above 200. I think today we're in the 60s in terms of dollars per ton. But I think we'll see revisions to that program fairly soon after CARB is done with its scoping plan, which I expect will bring the price back up. So there's the state program. There's a federal tax credit, which goes under the name of 45Q, and refers to the section of the Internal Revenue Code. And that was recently revised. So the Inflation Reduction Act revised that tax credit, I think, for the second time, and it significantly increased it. So now you can get up to $85 a ton of federal tax credit. And several of these types of projects that we have in mind here would be eligible for that. So I think for a lot of types of project and sectors that were not previously viable, we will see activity. And then finally, the bipartisan infrastructure law is doling out billions of dollars in these spaces. You know, it does come with certain requirements, and you need to meet certain specs. They issue so-called funding opportunity announcements, the DOE, the Department of Energy primarily, and these are being done at a rate that none of us have ever witnessed in the past. They have an unprecedented amount of funding to disperse, and they include hydrogen production, direct air capture, geologic site characterization, front-end engineering design studies for capture, for transports, pipelines, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the main sources that are available today. And I should also, since you mentioned capital, I also saw one last week that pertain to loan guarantees for these types of projects. So many Department of Energy offices are actively handing out, you know, either money or assistance right now.
Okay, Harold Mantle had a question about CO2 pipelines.
Yeah, my question was basically, have you looked into the existing CO2 pipelines? Chevron has several, and I don't know if they're active. I've been retired for quite a while, but I know that there exists in California CO2 pipelines that are connected to oil and gas reservoirs or oil reservoirs.
No CO2 pipelines in California that I'm aware of. We have just over 5,000 miles of CO2 pipeline in the US. And these transport CO2 from natural sources. So from it's being extracted from deep underground using wells and then transported, in some cases, thousands of miles to oil fields where it's injected for enhanced oil recovery. But there's no CO2 transportation or injection via pipeline in California that I'm aware of.
I'm mistaken, and possibly I was thinking of steam injections. But
okay, Ann Massey, I believe, has a question. Ann, are you unmuted?
George, did you mean me?
I'm sorry. Ann Spalding, sorry.
No problem. Thanks. These technologies sound really promising, but I kept thinking about, okay, what are the risks, potential risks, and long-term impacts of the underground carbon capture and also the nitrogen? Now, a background question: what do we do with all the nitrogen? So sorry if those are naive questions.
Sarah, do you want to address nitrogen, and I will take the underground storage risk question? Do you mean nitrous oxide emissions from non-energy sources?
I don't know.
So the stream that's injected is pure CO2. There's no nitrogen involved. You don't. It's not space efficient to inject ambient air, so you need to strip out the CO2, make sure that it's, you know, almost 100% of the injection stream, and that's what goes down the well.
I guess I'm wondering what happens then. You know, what happens then? What happens to the CO2? Is there any kind of risk associated with storing it underground, or does it, you know, go back into the environment? What happens to it?
Yes, there is. And let's take 20 seconds here to define risk. So risk is probability times consequence. So there are many things that could go wrong and many things that we do, you know, including in everyday life. Risk management entails, you know, have we reduced the probability of that happening? And, you know, if you look at driving on the freeway, natural gas pipes coming into your own house, all these things entail risks or hazards, you know, things that could go wrong, but we take steps to minimize them. So there are a number of things that could go wrong when you inject CO2 underground. The CO2 goes into solid rock. So if you've seen desert sandstone towers from Utah, for example, you pick up a chunk of rock from one of those, it looks solid. you can climb on it. That's where the CO2 goes. If you put that under a microscope, or if you put a sharpening stone in water, it will absorb in its microscopic pores, in that case water, in this case CO2. So we don't inject in large spaces or voids. We fill up the tiny spaces between rock grains. A catastrophic failure that suddenly burps out all of the CO2 that's injected is physically impossible. You read accounts from volcanic lakes. These are settings that have nothing to do with the sedimentary rocks that hold CO2. You can't replicate that. You can have well blowouts. You can have slow leaks from, say, wells that haven't been cemented or plugged properly. You could, in theory, have CO2 migrating along faults or fractures in the subsurface. Some of these things have been encountered. The regulations and the way project design and implementation work, they're pretty strict. So they are, in my book, the antithesis of oil and gas regulation. They've actually gone to great lengths to prevent things rather than deal with them after the effect. And we have probably hundreds of thousands, if not more, of oil and gas wells in the state. We have 0 CO2 injection wells, and I think the number that's being considered nationwide right now is a few tens of wells. So these are really museum items compared to your typical oil and gas well. So does that ever mean that nothing can go wrong? No. But because of the way you prevent, operate, and monitor the project, that we could spend hours on this, you minimize the risk to the point where we feel confident in saying that this is far less risky than many other things that are routinely practiced, such as natural gas storage, oil and gas extraction. And the decades worth of studies on this have shown that there being, a very small number, so single percentage points of snafus, none of these were catastrophic. And they have yielded lessons that can be avoided. The vast majority of demonstrations have been successful. So
thanks,
I'm not
George.
trying to diminish. This could take a whole day workshop, but there are risks, but they can be managed.
George, I have a question. Just one of your early slides was the 2-degree line. That I'm assuming that's global data, right? That's looking at it from a global perspective. So I guess it just kind of begs the question of, California is leading the way, but where else in the United States and where else outside the United States is this type of action taking place to focus on net zero carbon?
So there's been a flurry of net zero commitments in recent years. And I think it's only, honestly, I think it's the last 2 or 3 that it's really become mainstream. So there are coalitions of corporations that have pledged carbon neutrality by a certain date. Nations have done the same. Jurisdictions within nations have done the same. So I think California is one of the US states that has done this. My own personal feeling, if I'm going to be candid, I think this is indicative of the level of ambition. And a decade ago, this would not have been mainstream or possible. Nonetheless, I look at all these commitments and I think a lot of you have no clue how you're going to get there. And we are trying to sort of peel that onion a little bit and say, okay, let's see if there are ways to get there, and let's see how you do it. And what we are faced with is frankly an uphill slog in terms of project design, project development, permitting, public communication. I think one of the areas that I think we think could be a showstopper for this is how the public is going to react to these ideas. communities, and here in California, we've done an absolutely horrendous job protecting some of our communities from some of the worst impacts from industry, and that has created a very strong feeling of mistrust and skepticism. It's primarily towards oil and gas and refining and biomass combustion, but this sentiment understandably spills over to carbon removal. So there are many things that could derail what is an arduous endeavor.
So we're still open for questions. At some point, Gary, will turn it back over to you for a wrap up here. But Gary, did you have
George?
Oh,
Hi.
Jody.
Hi, it's Jody London. I'm the Sustainability Coordinator for Contra Costa County, and I put a question in the chat. George, you started to hit on this in your last response, but we have a large number of communities in our county that have been really disproportionately impacted by the refining industry. And I'm curious how you're going to prevent them from being further, not you personally, but how will this new technology, what steps are being put in place? I heard you talk very eloquently about what you're going to do around biodiversity, but how are we going to protect the people who live near these facilities and make sure that they don't continue to be disproportionately harmed by this new technology?
Yeah, great question. The challenge that we've set ourselves, and we are optimists, and we have to be, is that you can serve both the climate and you can serve communities. And I think this is something that is best done at an individual project level. So the key impacts to disadvantaged communities from petroleum refineries and other facilities has been air pollution, toxics, criteria pollutants. So one of the obvious questions that arises is, if you install carbon capture at a particular facility, or if you build a new project that takes waste biomass from the forest that CAL FI has removed for fuel reduction purposes, is that going to create a new source of air pollution? So the literature on this is alarmingly sparse, but nonetheless, we see that there are distinct trends and conclusions to be drawn. So I think in the next 2 or 3 years, you will see this literature being greatly expanded. But the technology that we're talking about, and neither petroleum refining nor biomass burning. So the main source of hydrogen that Sarah mentioned is gasification. So these things are very different to combustion plants. They're done at high temperature and high pressure, and they emit a tiny fraction of the pollution that a typical combustion plant that you may be familiar with in your neighborhoods.
But there's also transport, correct? Right? Like there's going to be pipelines. You're going to want to inject this carbon somewhere. Yep. And which communities will those pipelines go through? I think those are considerations that this is the second time I've heard this presentation. And I confess, I'm skeptical. I was working on carbon capture stuff 25 years ago in Bakersfield. We're going to do enhanced oil recovery of all these things. So I think that's something I would encourage you and your colleagues to really research, because, telling communities, oh, don't worry, we're going to build a pipeline, you won't be impacted. They're not going to believe you. They've already been harmed.
No, we're well aware of that, and we're actually involved in 3 projects that are funded by the Department of Energy. 2 are in Kern County, 1 is in Stockton, where our research partners are community groups themselves, and we're taking a deep dive into both their issues and the technological dimensions of doing this. So yeah, I know we're not trying to diminish anything here. I think the cumulative effects have been very real and very detrimental, and we need to make absolutely sure that we not only that we not make things worse, but that we actually improve conditions for these communities, and we think we can do that.
George, I just want to jump in really quick and say we've got about 4 minutes. And I do know that someone put in the chat a question about how folks can receive further information about.
Yeah, Lynn McGuire.
And yeah, so I did want to just draw attention to that and that Gary has his hand raised. So just knowing we've got about 4 minutes, I just thought we'd try to wrap up.
Lynn McGuire has a question real quick, and then Gary to wrap it up.
Yeah, George, thank you for all that discussion. I am really intrigued with the whole topic and the document that you pointed to related to permitting as being one of the biggest challenges. And you've obviously spent some time really looking at that. So my question in the chat was around the kind of reaction that you've received on the recommendations from, you know, some of the agencies in the state and CNRA. Are they on board to function like, you know, the CEC you mentioned process kind of similar to that? And I've been through that during the early 2000s, late 90s, when there was an energy crisis in the state, and experienced firsthand what expedited permitting could look like. You know, projects that would normally take a 18-month process. We successfully got a permit in 5 months through that process, and know that it can be done. But all the considerations that Jody just raised, and that around communities and making sure that a thorough process is pursued in the cases of these are at odds with one another. And just kind of curious around whether CNRA is kind of how much have they considered really taking that kind of function on as a one-stop shop?
So this is literally hot off the press. It was voted on the last day in August. So, you know, the dust hasn't settled. I have not spoken to CNRA since the bill was enacted. But, you know, that's what the legislature decided. Regarding CO2 pipelines, there is actually a ban on constructing CO2 pipelines in the state until the federal regulator PHMSA concludes a rulemaking that they're undertaking right now in response to the biggest incident in their records ever from 2 years ago in Mississippi. And I think someone mentioned enhanced oil recovery. The bill also banned that practice. So in California, you can no longer, not that anybody had done it, but you can no longer inject CO2 in an oil field in order to increase oil production.
Okay, with that, go, Lynn, I guess we got to wrap up here and then go to Gary, but one more comment.
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to say, I was also the one who asked about, is there a way to receive notices or information? It seems like the role of your group has, the group has grown and the role has expanded quite a lot in terms of, research, education, and maybe advisement and others. So, yeah, if you can kind of clue us in on to how to kind of keep track of things, that would be great.
So we're a contractor to the federal government, so we certainly do not lobby, and we also cannot blog unless we do it on a personal capacity. Sarah, is there a way to keep track of technical, scientific announcements? You know, if a report comes out, you'll probably hear about it. But how else could we help our friends here track milestones?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's something we can discuss. But yeah, that's the main way we communicate is presentations and reports.
Well, then we're glad to have you here.
Yeah, absolutely. So
George,
Gary,
are we good to turn it over to Gary? Perfect.
Yeah, Gary, it's time to wrap her up. I think, did you have a quick question, Gary, and then a wrap up?
I did, but it's too late. So I'll reach back around to George and Sarah with what my question is. I'm involved in 2 gasification projects in the state of California right now that are going through permitting. So I could use your awareness and your help. But hey, thank you guys so much for presenting today. You can tell that there's a lot of great questions by our group. It is cutting edge, this concept, and so I very much appreciate you guys sharing that information with us. And thank you. And again, best of luck and wishes to you, Lindy, on your maternity leave.
Thank you so much, Gary. Thank you, everyone. See you in 2023.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone.
Thanks, George and Sarah, again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thank you.
Thanks for having us.